It's a face you know. A stylized, smiling mask with a thin black mustache and a pointed goatee. You've seen it at protests in London, on the streets of Hong Kong, in the virtual town squares of the internet. It is the face of the hacker collective Anonymous. It is the face of modern rebellion, a universal symbol of the fight against tyranny, of the people against the powerful. It stands for freedom. But the story of the man behind the mask is not about freedom. It's about faith, gunpowder, and a failed act of terror so audacious it has echoed through history for over 400 years. This is the story of a man who wanted to burn an entire system of government to the ground, a man who was tortured and executed as a traitor to the state. This is the story of how history's most famous terrorist became a global symbol of liberation. His name was Guy Fawkes, and in the dead of night on the 5th of November, 1605, he was waiting in a dark, damp cellar beneath the English House of Lords, sitting beside 36 barrels of gunpowder. He was about to light a fuse that would not just kill a king, but change the world forever. He failed. But in his failure, he became immortal. This is the story of the man who lost his war, only to win a place in legend. To understand how a man or any group of men could be driven to such an extreme and monstrous act, you cannot begin with the man himself. You must first understand the world that made him. You have to travel back in time to an England that had been tearing itself apart for the better part of a century, racked by a single seismic question that poisoned every aspect of life, from the court of the monarch down to the humblest village. How should one worship God? For decades, the country had been in a state of profound religious schizophrenia, violently lurching between two competing, irreconcilable versions of Christianity. The spiritual bedrock of 1,000 years had been shattered, and the aftershocks were still shaking the very foundations of the nation. It had all started as so many great ruptures in history do, not with a grand theological debate, but with a king's dynastic desperation. King Henry VIII, a man of huge appetites, intellect, and ego, was haunted by the need for a son. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter, Mary, but after numerous stillbirths and infant deaths, it became clear she would not produce a male heir. Without a son, Henry feared a return to the brutal civil wars, the Wars of the Roses, that had ravaged England before his father took the throne. His gaze fell upon the charismatic and cunning Anne Boleyn, who refused to be his mistress and insisted on becoming his queen. The solution for Henry was an annulment. He asked Pope Clement VII to declare his marriage to Catherine invalid, arguing that it had been illegitimate from the start as she was his brother's widow. Under normal circumstances, the Pope might have found a way to accommodate the powerful English king, but these were not normal circumstances. Pope Clement was at that moment effectively the prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's beloved nephew. Charles would not stand for the dishonoring of his aunt. The Pope, caught between two powerful monarchs, prevaricated. Henry, never a patient man, would not wait. Fueled by his own ambition, the whispered advice of radical reformers like Thomas Cromwell, and the promise of a new world offered by Anne Boleyn, he took a step that was previously unthinkable. He broke with the Catholic Church in Rome. In a series of revolutionary parliamentary acts between 1532 and 1534, Henry VIII severed the 1,000-year-old ties that bound England to the papacy. He declared himself the supreme head of a new national institution, the Church of England. This was not initially a Protestant Reformation in the mold of Martin Luther or John Calvin. Henry considered himself a Catholic in doctrine. He simply wanted a Catholic Church without a pope, but in breaking the dam, he unleashed a flood he could not control. To solidify his power and, more importantly, To fill his depleted treasury, he enacted the dissolution of the monasteries. Over the next 4 years, the vast network of monasteries, abbeys, and convents that had been centers of learning, charity, and economic life for centuries were systematically dismantled. Their immense wealth, their land, their gold, their art was seized by the crown. For a devout and traditional populace, this was a horrifying sacrilege. In the north of England, it triggered a massive uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, where tens of thousands of commoners marched to demand a return to the old ways. It was brutally crushed. The message was clear. The king's will was absolute. England's religious identity was now subject to the whims of the monarch. The turmoil only deepened after Henry's death. His frail son Edward VI ascended the throne as a boy. But the men who ruled in his name, the Lord Protectors Somerset and Northumberland, were fervent, committed Protestants. Under Edward, the English Reformation accelerated dramatically. Statues were smashed, stained glass windows were shattered, and ancient rituals were outlawed in a wave of iconoclasm. The Latin Mass was abolished and replaced with a new English language service, enforced by the Book of Common Prayer, a work of profound literary beauty, but one which was utterly alien to a population accustomed to the old rites. For the first time, England was becoming a genuinely Protestant country in its theology and practice. But Edward's reign was short. He died at 15, and the crown passed to his half-sister, Mary I. Mary was the daughter of the spurned Catherine of Aragon. She had spent her entire life in the shadow of her father's break with Rome, a traumatic experience that saw her mother cast aside and herself declared a bastard. Her faith was all she had left, and it was a faith that was as intensely and devoutly Catholic as Edward's had been Protestant. She was determined to drag England back to the Roman fold, to undo everything her father and brother had done, and to cleanse the land of the heresy that had, in her eyes, so grievously wounded it. Her methods were brutal and uncompromising. She reinstated the heresy laws, and her government began a systematic campaign to hunt down and punish those who refused to renounce Protestantism. Over the course of her 5-year reign, nearly 300 people, men and women, educated bishops and humble artisans, were publicly burned at the stake. The public spectacle of these executions, with victims like Bishops Latimer and Ridley, who died with defiant courage, was intended to terrify the populace into submission. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. The burnings created a generation of Protestant martyrs, and the stories of their suffering, widely publicized in John Fawkes' Book of Martyrs, forever associated the Catholic cause with foreign cruelty and persecution. Mary's marriage to the dour and deeply unpopular King Philip II of Spain only cemented this image. She earned a title that would cling to her forever, Bloody Mary. Her reign, too, was short. Then came Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn. Her long reign, lasting nearly half a century, was a masterclass in political survival. She sought to navigate a treacherous middle path, the via media, that would hopefully bring peace to her fractured kingdom. She reestablished the Protestant Church of England with the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity in 1559, but her new church was a compromise. It was Protestant in doctrine, but it retained some of the familiar structure and ceremony of the old church, such as bishops and cathedrals. For a time, she adopted a pragmatic, almost tolerant approach. As long as Catholics paid lip service to the new order and practiced their faith quietly, in the privacy of their own homes, she was inclined to turn a blind eye. Her famous declaration that she had no desire to make windows into men's souls signaled a hope that the old faith might simply wither and die over time. This fragile tolerance was not to last. The forces of the wider European counter-Reformation would not leave England in peace. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull, Regnans in Excelsis, which declared Elizabeth a heretic, excommunicated her, and, crucially, absolved her Catholic subjects of any duty of loyalty to her. This was a political earthquake. It transformed a religious question into a matter of high treason. Overnight, every Catholic in England became a potential traitor in the eyes of the state. The Pope had effectively commanded them to choose between their queen and their God. From that moment on, the Elizabethan state saw itself as being at war with a Catholic fifth column, an enemy within directed from Rome and Madrid. A vast network of spies, led by the brilliant and ruthless Sir Francis Walsingham, was established to root out this threat. Their fears were not unfounded. A series of Catholic plots to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, were uncovered and thwarted. These plots, the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot, each led to tighter restrictions and a more paranoid atmosphere. The final discovery of Mary's complicity in the Babington plot led to her execution in 1587, an event that sent shock waves through Catholic Europe. The geopolitical struggle reached its climax in 1588 with the sailing of the mighty Spanish Armada. Sent by King Philip II of Spain to conquer England and restore Catholicism by force, this invincible fleet was famously defeated by a combination of English naval ingenuity and, more significantly, a massive storm, a Protestant wind, as the English called it, which they saw as clear evidence of God's divine favor for their cause. In this climate of existential fear and paranoia, life for the remaining English Catholics became a living nightmare. The state now actively hunted the Catholic faith. It became high treason, punishable by the most agonizing death imaginable, to be a Catholic priest in England. Jesuit missionaries, trained on the continent and smuggled into the country in disguise, were treated as enemy agents. If caught, they were tortured for information about their networks, and then publicly executed by being hanged, drawn, and quartered, a ritual of state-sanctioned savagery designed to inflict maximum pain and terror. Lay families who sheltered these priests faced the same fate. For ordinary Catholics, the pressure was immense. The recusancy laws fined families crippling sums of money for refusing to attend the mandatory Protestant services of the Church of England. These fines could bankrupt even wealthy landowners over time. Their homes were subject to sudden, violent raids at any hour of the day or night, with officials smashing down walls and tearing up floorboards in search of priest holes, tiny, cleverly concealed secret chambers where clergymen would hide, sometimes for days on end, in suffocating darkness. For a generation of English Catholics, their own country had become hostile territory. They lived as outlaws in their own land, their loyalty constantly in question, their faith a potential death sentence. They were trapped, impoverished, and persecuted, watching their ancient faith being slowly and brutally strangled. It was a world of secret masses, whispered prayers, and constant gnawing fear. This, then, was the broken, violent, and fanatically divided world that forged the conspirators of 1605. The Elizabethan settlement had brought a measure of stability, but for the Catholic minority, it was a peace enforced by crippling fines, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of a horrific death. An entire generation had been raised in a world of secret faith and righteous grievance, creating a fertile ground for extremism. Into this tinderbox of persecution and piety, a child was born in the Protestant North. To truly understand the Gunpowder plot, we must first understand the man who would become its most famous instrument, a man whose personal journey would carry him from the heart of the Protestant establishment into the soul of the Catholic resistance, transforming him from an English gentleman into a holy warrior. Into this seething cauldron of religious strife in the ancient city of York in the spring of 1570, Guy Fawkes was born. And here, at the very beginning of his life, lies the first and most profound irony of his story. The man who would become England's most infamous Catholic plotter was not born a Catholic. He was born a Protestant, baptized into the very Church of England, whose parliament he would later try to obliterate. His family was not part of the oppressed Catholic minority. On the contrary, they were well-established members of the Protestant establishment. His father, Edward Fawkes, was a respected lawyer, holding the posts of proctor and advocate in the Protestant ecclesiastical courts of the Archbishop of York. He was, by profession, a pillar of the Elizabethan religious settlement, a man whose career was intertwined with the enforcement of the new church's authority. The Fawkes family was part of the comfortable gentry, neither fabulously wealthy nor struggling, but secure in their social standing. Young Guy, or Guido, as he would one day call himself, seemed destined for a conventional and respectable life. He would likely have followed his father into the law, or managed his inherited properties, a loyal subject of the Queen and a conforming member of the national church. He was a product of the system, not its enemy. But fate, in the form of personal tragedy, intervened to tear him from this path. When Guy was just 8 years old, his father died. This single event shattered the predictable trajectory of his life. His mother, Edith, was left a widow with a young family to care for. After a few years, she remarried, and her choice of a new husband would change the course of her son's life forever. His name was Dionys Bainbrig, and he came from a family in Scotland, a village near Knaresborough. Unlike the Fawkes family, the Bainbrigs were devout, practicing Catholics who had resisted the Reformation. Through his stepfather and the move to Scotland, the young, impressionable Guy Fawkes was transplanted into a completely different world. He was plunged into the heart of Yorkshire's underground Catholic network. The area was a known hotbed of recusancy, home to prominent Catholic families like the Pullanes and the Percys, who clung stubbornly to the old faith despite the immense risks. This was not the world of public ceremony and state-enforced religion he had known in York. It was a world of secret faith and quiet, determined defiance. He would have been exposed to the hushed conversations, the constant fear of raids, and perhaps even the sight of a disguised priest being sheltered at great peril. He would have witnessed firsthand the piety and courage of people who risked their property, their freedom, and their very lives for what they believed was the one true church. We don't know the exact moment of his conversion. There was no single dramatic event recorded for posterity. It seems to have been a gradual absorption of the beliefs, the grievances, and the unwavering conviction of the people who now surrounded him. He saw their suffering. He saw their quiet dignity in the face of persecution. He heard the stories of the martyrs and the injustices of the Protestant regime. And in his young heart, a fire was lit. The Protestant church of his father was no longer his own. It became the church of the oppressor. He came to believe with all the fervor of a convert that the entire Protestant establishment was illegitimate, a heresy imposed upon a Catholic nation, and that the true spiritual authority lay not in London with the Queen, but in Rome with the Pope. As he grew into a young man, Fawkes cut an impressive figure. Contemporaries described him as tall and powerfully built, with thick brown hair and a flowing mustache, a man of imposing physical presence. By all accounts, he was not a great talker or a scholar. His temperament was one of action, not words. He was known for his loyalty, his courage, and a steely, quiet determination. One Jesuit priest who knew him later described him as a man of great piety, of exemplary temperance, of mild and cheerful demeanor, an enemy of broils and disputes, a faithful friend. But beneath that mild, soldierly exterior was an iron will, forged in the fires of religious conviction. He was not a man for half measures or theological compromise. He saw the world in black and white, a grand struggle between the forces of God and the forces of heresy. He was a man of absolute faith, and he was searching for a cause worthy of that faith, a way to translate his beliefs into meaningful action. He found that cause not in the clandestine world of English recusancy, but on the bloody battlefields of mainland Europe. Frustrated by the oppression in his homeland and eager to fight for his beliefs in a more direct way, Fawkes took a decisive step. In his early 20s, around 1591, he sold the property he had inherited from his father, effectively severing his ties to his old life, and left England. He traveled to the continent and enlisted as a mercenary in the Spanish army fighting in the Netherlands. This was the 80 Years' War, a brutal, grinding conflict where the vast Catholic Spanish Empire was trying to crush a seemingly endless rebellion by its Protestant Dutch subjects. It was one of the main fronts in the Europe-wide struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism, a war characterized by long, bloody sieges, savage atrocities, and religious fanaticism on both sides. For 10 years, Fawkes fought as a soldier of fortune, a mercenary for his faith. Here, in the mud and blood of Flanders, the English gentleman was burned away, leaving behind a hardened military professional. He learned the grim practical arts of war, how to handle explosives, how to lay siege to a fortified city, how to dig tunnels or mines to blow up enemy walls, and how to kill without flinching. He served with distinction under the command of the Archduke Albert of Austria, the governor of the Spanish Netherlands. He participated in significant military actions, including the Spanish capture of Calais from the French in 1596. He earned a reputation not as a great commander, but as a technically proficient and utterly dependable junior officer, known for his expertise with gunpowder and his unwavering courage under fire. It was during these years that he began to call himself Guido, the Italian/Spanish version of his English name. The change was deeply symbolic. It signaled a complete transfer of his allegiance. He no longer saw himself as an Englishman fighting abroad, but as a soldier of Catholic Europe, his identity defined by his faith rather than his nationality. This decade spent in the trenches and siege lines was the crucial crucible that forged the man who would kneel in the cellar beneath Parliament. It turned the disaffected young Englishman into a seasoned veteran of a holy war. He was no longer just a believer. He was a soldier who had seen firsthand that the great religious questions of the age were being decided not by prayer and debate, but by pike and cannon and gunpowder. His worldview was stripped down to the stark realities of the battlefield. By 1603, his military reputation and his unwavering commitment to the cause led him to be chosen for a different kind of mission, one that required diplomacy rather than force. He traveled to the court of King Philip III in Spain. His task was to persuade the Spanish monarch to launch another great invasion of England. He carried with him the hopes of a faction of English Catholics who believed that only foreign intervention could save them. He argued passionately that a Spanish army landing in England would be the catalyst for a massive Catholic uprising that would finally depose the heretical regime. But the political winds had shifted. Spain, overstretched and nearly bankrupt after decades of constant warfare, was weary of the conflict with England. The Great Armada of 1588 had been a catastrophic failure, and there was little appetite for another such gamble. Furthermore, Queen Elizabeth I had just died, and the new king, James I, was seeking to make peace with Spain. King Philip III and his powerful chief minister, the Duke of Lerma, listened to Fawkes but ultimately offered him nothing but empty platitudes. The mission was a total failure. Guido Fawkes returned from Spain empty-handed and deeply disillusioned. The dream of a grand foreign-backed Catholic rebellion was dead. The great Catholic power of Spain had abandoned them to their fate. The English Catholics, he now realized with bitter certainty, were on their own. If they were to be saved, they would have to save themselves. The soldier had tried diplomacy and found it wanting. He was now a man without a war to fight, a zealot whose last hope for a conventional solution had been extinguished. He was a weapon, honed by a decade of war and fueled by a lifetime of conviction, waiting for a new master and a new mission. While Fawkes was being forged in this continental crucible, the situation back in England was finally reaching its breaking point. The death of an old queen and the accession of a new king brought a fleeting, desperate moment of hope, but its swift and bitter betrayal would push a charismatic and furious English gentleman to conceive of a plan of unimaginable violence, a plan for which he would need a man with precisely Guido Fawkes's deadly expertise. While Guido Fawkes was on the continent fighting in the trenches and pleading in the courts of Europe, the situation in England had been thrown into a state of dramatic uncertainty. In March 1603, after a reign of 44 years, Queen Elizabeth I died, the Virgin Queen, who had ruled for so long that most of her subjects could remember no other monarch, left no direct heir. The crown passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who now rode south to London to become King James I of England. For England's beleaguered Catholic community, this was a moment of breathless, almost desperate hope. James's life story seemed to offer tantalizing clues that he might be their savior. His mother was the Catholic martyr, Mary, Queen of Scots, executed by Elizabeth. His wife, Anne of Denmark, was widely known to be a Catholic convert. Surely, they reasoned, a man with such a mother and such a wife would be more tolerant than the staunchly Protestant Elizabeth. This hope was fanned into a flame by the king himself. On his journey south and in the early days of his reign, James made private assurances to prominent Catholic envoys, including one of the future plotters, Thomas Percy. He hinted that the brutal recusancy fines would be abolished and that private worship would be permitted. A wave of cautious optimism swept through the Catholic underground. It felt like the dawn of a new era. It was a false dawn. Once he was securely on the throne of England, King James I quickly discovered the political realities of his new kingdom. He was a foreign king in a land deeply suspicious of his Scottish origins, and he faced a powerful Protestant parliament and an entrenched establishment that viewed Catholicism as synonymous with treason and foreign domination. His chief minister, the brilliant and deeply anti-Catholic Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, skillfully guided him away from any notion of tolerance. Within a year, the king's promises were forgotten. Far from ending the persecution, James publicly declared his utter detestation of Catholicism. The recusancy fines were not abolished. They were collected with renewed vigor and efficiency. Priests were once again expelled from the kingdom under threat of death. For the English Catholics, the despair was crushing. The brief glimmer of hope had been extinguished, leaving behind a darkness more profound than before. for a small group of desperate Catholic gentlemen, men of wealth and standing, who had risked much for their faith, this royal betrayal was the final straw. They had tried prayer. They had tried patience. They had tried appealing to foreign powers. Now they felt all peaceful paths were closed. Hope curdled into a cold, hard rage. An idea began to form in the mind of one man, an idea so monstrous, so utterly devastating in its scope, that it would either succeed spectacularly or damn them all for eternity. And to pull it off, they would eventually need a man with military experience, an expert in gunpowder, and a man whose face was not known in the back alleys of London. They would need Guido Fawkes. The architect of the gunpowder plot was not Guy Fawkes. Fawkes was the muscle, the technician, the professional soldier brought in to execute a specific task. The mastermind, the heart and soul of the conspiracy was a man named Robert Catesby. Catesby was, in many ways, the polar opposite of the taciturn Fawkes. He was a charismatic, wealthy, and well-connected courtier, known for his charm, his passionate nature, and his magnetic influence over others. Standing over 6 feet tall, he was a natural leader who drew men to him. Like Fawkes, he was a devout Catholic, but his family had a long and painful history of suffering for their faith. His father had been imprisoned multiple times for harboring priests. Catesby himself was a man who had been pushed to the very edge. His passionate faith was matched by a hot-headed temperament. In 1601, he had been a zealous participant in the Essex Revolt, a foolish and ill-fated attempt by the Earl of Essex to overthrow Queen Elizabeth's government. Catesby was wounded and captured. To escape a traitor's death, he was forced to pay a colossal fine of £3,000, a sum so large he had to sell his finest family estate at Chastleton to raise the funds. The experience had radicalized him. It left him impoverished, humiliated, and simmering with a righteous fury. He had tried open rebellion, and it had failed. He would not make the same mistake again. His next strike would come not on a battlefield, but from the darkness in a single, unanswerable blow. In the spring of 1604, in the respectable surroundings of the Duck and Drake Inn in London, Catesby gathered a small group of trusted friends and relatives. There was his cousin, Thomas Wintour, a soldier, scholar, and linguist, who was initially the most hesitant of the group. There was John Jack Wright, a close friend from their school days, and a man renowned throughout England as a deadly swordsman. And there was Thomas Percy, a relative of the powerful Earl of Northumberland and a court official who had been the one to receive King James's empty promises. He was a late but ferocious convert to Catesby's cause, consumed with a sense of personal betrayal. In a private room in that inn, Robert Catesby unveiled his shocking proposal. It was, he argued, no longer enough to try and kill the king. That would simply mean he would be replaced by another Protestant heir from his line. The problem was not the man, it was the entire system. The king, his heirs, the bishops of the Church of England, the judges, the entire Protestant aristocracy who made and enforced the laws that had crushed them for so long, they were all part of the same corrupt, heretical structure. Catesby's plan was to wipe them all out. He would do it during the state opening of Parliament, the one time when the entire ruling class would be gathered together in a single room. He would blow up the House of Lords with a massive quantity of gunpowder. In the chaos that would surely follow this apocalyptic blast, they would launch an uprising in the Midlands, kidnap the king's 9-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, and install her on the throne as a puppet Catholic queen to be raised and married as they saw fit. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity and horrifying carnage. Thomas Wintour was aghast, arguing that such an act would damn us all. He begged Catesby to allow him one last attempt at securing foreign help from Spain. Catesby, confident it would fail, agreed. Wintour traveled to the continent but found no support. The Spanish were negotiating peace and would not listen. It was there, however, in the English expatriate community in Flanders, that he was introduced to a fellow Englishman. He was a soldier with a steely gaze and a quiet competence, a man who had spent a decade fighting for the Catholic cause and who had just returned from his own failed mission to Spain. Wintour was deeply impressed. He told the man, Guido Fawkes, that they were planning something in England and asked if he would join them. Fawkes, battle-hardened and utterly disillusioned with diplomacy, agreed without hesitation. It was enough that someone was finally willing to act. In May 1604, the 5 core conspirators, Catesby, Wintour, Wright, Percy, and now Guy Fawkes, met again in London. In a private room, they swore a solemn oath of secrecy on a prayer book. Then, in an act that reveals their state of mind, they stepped into an adjoining room where the celebrated Jesuit priest, Father John Gerard, was celebrating Mass. They took Holy Communion from his hands. Father Gerard was a wanted man who lived in constant danger, but he was completely unaware of their treasonous purpose. For the plotters, however, this sacrament was a sacred seal on their vow. In their minds, they were not terrorists embarking on a mission of mass murder. They were holy warriors, soldiers of Christ, undertaking a sacred duty that was now blessed by God. Their first great challenge was a practical one. How do you get a massive amount of explosives directly underneath the House of Lords? Their initial plan was painstakingly difficult. They would dig a tunnel. Thomas Percy used his courtly connections to rent a house in Westminster that stood right next to the Parliament building. For weeks, the conspirators, gentlemen who had likely never done a day of manual labor in their lives, toiled in secret. They worked in shifts, hacking away with pickaxes at the 9-foot-thick medieval foundation walls, their hands raw and bleeding. They transported the dirt and rubble out into the garden under the cover of darkness. The fear of discovery was constant. Every footstep on the street above, every unfamiliar noise, sent a jolt of panic through them. Then they got a stroke of extraordinary luck. As they were digging, they heard a rumbling sound from above. A terrified Catesby sent Fawkes, the unflappable soldier, to investigate. He returned with incredible news. A cellar or undercroft located directly beneath the House of Lords chamber itself was being cleared out. Its tenant, a coal merchant, was giving up his lease. It was a perfect, almost miraculous opportunity. Thomas Percy immediately swept in and rented the property, claiming he needed it to store firewood and other supplies for his master, the Earl of Northumberland. Their back-breaking tunneling problem was solved. The cellar was dark, cavernous, and perfectly positioned. Now they needed the gunpowder. Over the next few months, they gradually smuggled in 36 barrels of black powder, ferrying them by boat across the River Thames at night. It was an enormous quantity, far more than they strictly needed. Estimates suggest it was well over a ton of explosive material. They hid the barrels under piles of firewood, and on Fawkes's professional advice, heavy iron bars, which would act as shrapnel to intensify the blast. The trap was set. Now all they had to do was wait for the state opening of Parliament. Guy Fawkes, with his military background and his face unknown to the London authorities, was given the most crucial and dangerous role. Using the alias John Johnson, he posed as Thomas Percy's servant. He was to be the watchman, the guardian of the cellar, and at the last moment, the man who would light the fuse. The waiting began, and it was agonizing. The opening of Parliament, originally scheduled for early 1605, was repeatedly pushed back, first to October and then to November, due to a severe outbreak of the plague in London. The conspirators were forced to disperse, to return to their country estates and try to live normal lives while sitting on their terrible secret. The gunpowder stored in the damp cellar had to be periodically checked, a risky business. The tension was immense. During this time, the original group of 5 expanded to 13, as Catesby brought in more men with the money and resources needed for the planned Midlands uprising. But with each new recruit, the risk of a leak, of a fatal indiscretion, grew exponentially. Finally, a firm date was set, Tuesday, November 5th, 1605. The long, nerve-shredding wait was coming to an end. The plotters began to converge on London. The gunpowder was checked one last time and found to be in good condition. The plan, which had been born in whispered conversations over a year and a half earlier, was about to reach its fiery consummation. The conspiracy was now fully formed, a deadly machine meticulously assembled in secret. Led by the magnetic and implacable Robert Catesby and crewed by a dozen other determined men, the plot had been painstakingly prepared. Through a combination of backbreaking labor and a stroke of incredible luck, the cellar directly beneath the House of Lords had been secured. A massive cache of gunpowder, enough to obliterate the entire ruling class of England, lay hidden beneath a deceptive pile of firewood. The long, agonizing wait was over, the date was set, and the holy warriors were poised to strike their apocalyptic blow. But a plot built on such a terrible secret is inherently fragile. As the final day approached, the immense psychological pressure and the moral weight of their intended massacre began to create fractures within the group, leading to a fatal act of conscience, or of betrayal, that would place their secret into the hands of their most cunning enemy and trigger a tense, irreversible countdown to discovery. As October of 1605 bled into its final days, a palpable tension settled over London and the scattered country manors of the conspirators. The long, agonizing wait was nearly at an end. The date was firmly set, Tuesday the 5th of November. One by one, the plotters began to make their way toward the capital, their minds focused on the terrible, and in their view, holy work that lay ahead. The gunpowder lay silent and waiting in the dark cellar beneath the House of Lords, a monstrous secret guarded by the watchful soldier who called himself John Johnson. Everything was in place. Yet, as the day of reckoning drew near, a new and terrible dilemma began to gnaw at the edges of the conspiracy. It was a crisis not of logistics or of courage, but of conscience. Some of the plotters had friends, even relatives, who were members of Parliament. These men were Protestants, but they were not their enemies. More troubling still, there were a handful of Catholic lords who, despite their faith, would be in attendance at the state opening as part of their duty. Would they be killed alongside their Protestant oppressors? Would their holy mission to save English Catholicism begin by slaughtering some of the nation's most prominent Catholics? For some of the conspirators, particularly the newer recruits who lacked Robert Catesby's white-hot fanaticism, this was an unbearable thought. They had justified their plan as a divine act of righteous vengeance against a corrupt and heretical regime. But the cold reality of the indiscriminate slaughter they were about to unleash began to weigh heavily upon them. The chief worrier was Francis Tresham, a late addition to the plot, and a man whose commitment seems to have wavered. He was consumed by the fact that his brother-in-law, the Catholic Lord Monteagle, would be in the chamber. He pleaded with Catesby to find a way to warn him. Catesby was ruthless. His resolve was absolute, his vision unclouded by sentiment. He argued that any attempt to warn specific individuals would be a fatal risk. A single leak would bring the entire enterprise crashing down upon their heads. The mission, he insisted, was greater than any individual life. In a chilling statement that captured his brutal pragmatism, He reportedly told his wavering comrades the innocent must perish with the guilty. It was better, he argued, to sacrifice a few Catholic friends than to risk the failure of their God-given quest to restore the true church in England. But not everyone agreed. Someone's conscience or their fear finally cracked. On the evening of Saturday, October the 26th, just 10 days before the planned attack, Lord Monteagle was settling down for dinner at his house in Hoxton. As he sat, a footman appeared, informing him that a mysterious letter had just been delivered for him by an unknown man on the dark street, who had urged that it be read by the Lord's own hand. The letter was anonymous, the handwriting disguised and barely legible. Monteagle broke the seal and began to read. The message was vague, yet deeply alarming. "My lord," it began, "out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament. For God and man have concurred to punish the wickedness of this time." It went on, urging him to retreat to the safety of the countryside and burn the letter, before concluding with a terrifyingly cryptic warning. "For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them." Monteagle was terrified and bewildered. He was a Catholic and had been involved in minor plots before, but this was something different. A terrible blow from an unseen hand? He didn't know what to make of it, but he knew it was too dangerous to ignore. In a decision that would seal the fate of the conspiracy, he immediately took the letter and rode to Whitehall, delivering it directly into the hands of the King's chief minister and spymaster Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. Cecil was a brilliant, cunning, and profoundly anti-Catholic politician. Small and hunchbacked, he possessed a formidable intellect and a mastery of the dark arts of espionage, inherited from his famous father, Sir William Cecil, who had been Queen Elizabeth's great spymaster. When Monteagle presented the letter, Cecil read it and affected a suitable level of concern, but his mind was likely racing with possibilities. And here lies one of the great, enduring mysteries of the Gunpowder plot. Did the Monteagle letter truly come as a surprise to him, or was it merely the public unveiling of a conspiracy he already knew everything about? Many historians argue that Cecil, with his vast network of spies and informants, almost certainly knew about the plot long before the letter arrived. They suggest he may have had an agent inside the conspiracy from the beginning, carefully nurturing it, allowing it to proceed almost to its conclusion. Why? Because a half-formed plot discovered too early was a minor political victory, but a monstrous plot to assassinate the king and Parliament, foiled at the very last second, was a political goldmine. By revealing such a terrifying Catholic conspiracy at the most dramatic possible moment, he could create a tidal wave of public fear and anti-Catholic hysteria. This would allow him to crush his Catholic political enemies once and for all, pass a new and even more oppressive series of laws, and consolidate his own power at the right hand of a grateful king. In this version of the story, Catesby and Fawkes were not the masters of their own destiny, but unwitting pawns in Cecil's brilliant and cynical game. Cecil's actions in the days that followed lend weight to this theory. He did not order an immediate, thorough search of the Parliament buildings. Instead, he did something strange. He waited. He held on to the letter through Sunday, through Monday, through Tuesday. He let the plot ripen. Meanwhile, news of the letter had leaked back to the conspirators. One of Monteagle's servants, loyal to Catesby, rushed to inform them that their secret was out. Panic erupted. They knew they had been betrayed. The obvious suspect was Francis Tresham, Monteagle's own brother-in-law. Tresham denied it vehemently, but the others were convinced he was the traitor. Most of the plotters wanted to flee the country, to abandon the plot immediately. It was over. But Robert Catesby, with his unshakable, almost insane nerve, refused to give up. He argued that the letter was too vague, that the authorities would dismiss it as a hoax written by a madman. Even if they did search, he reasoned, they would never find the cleverly hidden barrels. He made the fateful decision to hold his course. The only man he could trust to check the cellar, to assess the situation with a cool head and a soldier's eye, was Guido Fawkes. He sent Fawkes back into the lion's den. Fawkes went to the cellar, checked the powder in the hiding place, and reported back that nothing had been disturbed. He agreed with Catesby they would see the mission through to the end. It was a fatal decision, a testament to their fanaticism and their complete underestimation of their opponent. On Friday, November 1st, Cecil finally showed the letter to King James. The king, whose own father had been assassinated in a mysterious explosion at a house in Kirkfield, Scotland, seized upon the phrase, "a terrible blow," and guessed that it might refer to gunpowder. Cecil now had the king's full authority to act. Still, he waited through Saturday, through Sunday, through Monday. On the afternoon of Monday, November 4th, the day before the attack, a preliminary, almost deliberately casual search of the Parliament cellars was conducted. The search party led by the Lord Chamberlain found the cellar under the House of Lords. There they saw a huge pile of firewood, and standing beside it a tall, watchful man who called himself John Johnson. It was Guy Fawkes. When asked what he was doing, he calmly explained he was a servant of Mr. Thomas Percy, and the firewood was for his master. The search party, finding this a plausible explanation for such a large quantity of fuel, simply nodded and left. Fawkes immediately rushed to warn the other plotters of the close call. Again, they urged Catesby to flee. Again, he refused. He believed they had passed the inspection, that they had been cleared of suspicion. In a final disastrous act of bravado, he sent Guy Fawkes back to the cellar for one last watch. This was Guy Fawkes's finest and final hour as a free man. He knew the risk. He knew the authorities were suspicious enough to have conducted a search, but his sense of duty, his loyalty to the cause was absolute. He returned to the cellar alone. He was dressed for travel, wearing a cloak, a hat, and boots with spurs, ready for a swift escape. In his pockets he carried a slow match, a fuse designed to burn slowly, and a watch to time the explosion. He was prepared to light the fuse, walk calmly away, and make his escape across the River Thames in the ensuing chaos. He sat there in the cold, damp darkness, surrounded by enough gunpowder to reduce the heart of London to rubble, and he waited for the dawn. But dawn would not come for him. Around midnight, another search party arrived, this one led by a justice of the peace, and it was far more serious. They burst into the cellar and found Fawkes still standing guard, defiant to the last. This time, they were not fooled by the firewood. They pulled the logs away, and underneath, they found the barrels. Dozens of them. The game was up. Guy Fawkes was seized. The gunpowder plot was over. In the final nerve-wracking hours, the intricate plot unraveled with breathtaking speed. A cryptic letter, the patient and deadly cunning of the spy master Robert Cecil, and the unshakable fatal bravado of Robert Catesby all conspired to lead to one inevitable outcome: a midnight raid on a Westminster cellar. There, the stoic watchman Guy Fawkes was captured amidst his barrels of powder, his slow match still in his pocket. The plot was over mere hours before it was meant to begin, its grand fiery ambitions extinguished in the flickering torchlight of the king's men. For Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators, however, the end of the plot was merely the beginning of their own personal ordeal. Capture meant facing the full, terrifying power of the Jacobean state, a power that would be exercised through the systematic torments of the Tower, a desperate manhunt across the frozen Midlands, and the final brutal spectacle of a traitor's death. As the cellar door burst open and the flickering torchlight fell upon the barrels of gunpowder, the gunpowder plot was over. For Guy Fawkes, a new and far more personal hell was just beginning. He was caught red-handed, and he knew it. But the soldier's discipline held. He was immediately disarmed and searched. The slow matches and the watch found in his pockets were undeniable proof of his intent. Bound and under heavy guard, he was brought before the king's council in the early hours of the morning. Even here, in the presence of the most powerful men in the kingdom, he was not afraid. He was defiant, almost arrogant. When King James I himself, fascinated and horrified by the man who had come so close to killing him, asked what he had been planning to do with so much powder, Fawkes looked him coolly in the eye and said he intended to blow the king and all his Scottish lords back to Scotland. He was entirely unrepentant, expressing only one regret, that he had failed. He gave his name as John Johnson and steadfastly refused to name his co-conspirators. He was a soldier, and even in defeat he would not betray his comrades. His interrogators were simultaneously appalled by his purpose and impressed by his sheer nerve. The king himself was recorded to have remarked that this John Johnson possessed a Roman resolution. But that resolution was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. On November 6th, King James gave his official authorization to torture the prisoner. The royal warrant gave the torturers at the Tower of London permission to use the gentler tortures at first, but if he remained stubborn, they were free to proceed to the worst punishments their dark arts could devise. Guy Fawkes was taken by boat down the Thames to the dreaded Tower of London, a place of grim renown from which few prisoners emerged unbroken. The exact details of his torture are not recorded, lost to the secrecy of the Tower's interrogation chambers, but we can surmise the terrible process from standard practice. He was likely first subjected to the manacles, a form of torment where the prisoner was hung by his wrists for hours on end, the weight of his own body slowly dislocating his shoulders. When that failed to break his silence, he would have been moved to the Tower's most infamous instrument, the rack. This was a large wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's ankles and wrists were tied to these rollers, which were then turned in opposite directions by the torturers, slowly, agonizingly stretching the body. Joints would pop, muscles would tear, and the pain would be an excruciating, all-consuming fire, pushing a human being beyond the limits of their endurance. For days, Guy Fawkes resisted. The soldier in him, the devout believer who saw himself as a martyr for his faith, held on. But no one could resist the rack indefinitely. His body was systematically broken, and eventually his will followed. On November 8th, he began to talk. On November 9th, after what must have been an unbearable session of torture, he gave a full confession. He revealed his true name and the names of his fellow plotters, outlining the full details of their plan. He was then made to sign his confession, and that signature, preserved to this day in the National Archives, tells a more powerful story of suffering than any words. The first name, Guido, is written, but it is a weak, shaky scrawl, the hand of a man in absolute agony, barely able to hold the pen. The surname Fawkes is little more than a jagged, spidery line, trailing off into nothingness. It is the signature of a man whose body and spirit had been utterly shattered. While Fawkes was being broken in the Tower, the rest of the conspirators were being hunted across the English countryside. As soon as they heard of Fawkes's capture, they fled London, riding desperately for the Midlands, where they had planned to start their grand uprising. But there was no uprising. The news of their monstrous plot had spread like wildfire, carried by royal proclamation. It created a wave of national revulsion and horror. They were not seen as Catholic liberators. They were pariahs, the most wanted and hated men in the kingdom. Robert Catesby, Thomas Percy, and the others found no support. Sheriffs raised militias to pursue them. Ordinary citizens, once potential allies, now saw them as devils. They were just a small, desperate band of fugitives pursued relentlessly by the authorities. Their final pathetic stand came at Holbisha House in Staffordshire. A posse of 200 men surrounded the house. As the fugitives prepared for a siege, a final grim irony befell them. Some of their remaining gunpowder, which they had laid out to dry before a fire, accidentally ignited in a flash, burning and injuring several of them, including Catesby. A firefight erupted. Catesby and Thomas Percy, the two men who had started it all, were reportedly hit and mortally wounded by the same musket ball. They dragged themselves back inside the house, where they were found dying, clutching a picture of the Virgin Mary. The other surviving plotters were either killed in the shootout or captured. The hunt was over. The captured conspirators, along with a broken Guy Fawkes, were brought back to London to face trial in January 1606. It was a foregone conclusion. The trial held in Westminster Hall was a show trial, designed to publicly condemn the plotters and demonstrate the absolute power of the state. The evidence against them, much of it extracted from Fawkes's confession, was overwhelming. They were all found guilty of high treason. The sentence was the most horrifying punishment the law of the time could devise, reserved for the worst enemies of the state. They were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This meant they would be dragged through the streets to the place of execution, hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive, their genitals cut off and burned before their eyes, their bowels and heart pulled out, and finally their heads cut off and their bodies chopped into 4 pieces. The dismembered remains would then be parboiled and displayed in prominent places across the country as a gruesome and permanent warning to any other potential traitors. On January 31st, 1606, it was Guy Fawkes's turn to die. So weakened by his torture that he could barely walk, he had to be helped to the gallows, which had been erected in the old palace yard at Westminster, the very place he had intended to blow to smithereens. But even in this final moment of brokenness and degradation, the old soldier had one last act of defiance left in him. As he stood on the scaffold with the noose around his neck, he was meant to be pushed from the ladder to begin the slow, agonizing process of strangulation. Instead, whether by a final surge of will or a simple stumble, he jumped. His neck broke instantly, killing him and sparing him the unspeakable agony that was to follow. His lifeless body was still subjected to the rest of the horrific ritual, but he had cheated his executioners of their final cruel spectacle. The vengeance of the state was as swift as it was absolute. The plotters were hunted down, their bodies broken by torture, and their lives ended in a gruesome public ritual designed not merely to kill them, but to erase them from history as anything but cautionary figures of damnable treason. By every conceivable measure, their mission was a catastrophic failure. They did not save Catholicism. They doomed it to centuries of further repression. They did not overthrow the government. They reinforced it. Their grand design ended in their own utter destruction and the ruin of their cause. And yet, history is not always written by the victors. While the men themselves were destroyed, the memory of their audacious plot could not be so easily extinguished. The story of their failure would curdle into a strange and enduring legacy, one that would, over the course of centuries, transform the national bogeyman into a global icon, ensuring a strange and paradoxical immortality that none of them could have ever imagined. The failure of the Gunpowder Plot had immediate and devastating consequences for England's Catholics. The conspiracy, which had been born of a desperate desire to save them from persecution, instead came perilously close to destroying them completely. Robert Cecil and the government seized the opportunity with masterful efficiency. The plot was presented to a horrified public not as the work of a small band of extremist gentlemen, but as a vast Jesuit-led international conspiracy, irrefutable proof that all Catholics were potential traitors, secretly loyal to a foreign power. A wave of anti-Catholic hysteria, carefully stoked by the government, swept the nation. In the wake of this terror, a new, far harsher series of punitive laws, the Popish Recusants Act of 1606, was passed by a vengeful parliament. These new statutes made life for Catholics an ordeal of institutionalized discrimination. They were barred from voting, from practicing law or medicine, and from serving as officers in the army or navy. They could not live in or near London. Their movements were restricted, and their homes were subject to search at any time. They were effectively made second-class citizens in their own land, a status of suspicion and repression they would endure for over 200 years. The plot designed to liberate them had instead forged their chains anew. In the immediate aftermath, an act of a parliament was passed declaring November 5th a national day of thanksgiving for the king's miraculous deliverance. This was the birth of Bonfire Night, or Guy Fawkes Night. Across the country, people lit bonfires and celebrated the preservation of their king and country. At first, the effigies burned upon these fires were often of the Pope, the perceived foreign mastermind behind the Catholic threat. But over time, as the decades turned into centuries, the focus of public scorn shifted to the man who was caught in the cellar, the public face of the plot, the one whose name became synonymous with the event. Guy Fawkes became the national bogeyman, a figure of hate and ridicule, the archetypal traitor, the guy to be burned. For hundreds of years, this tradition continued. Children would make crude dummies of him from old clothes stuffed with straw, wheel them through the streets in wheelbarrows, and beg for a penny for the guy to buy fireworks. Then, as darkness fell, they would gleefully toss the effigy onto the flames. The famous rhyme, taught to generations of English schoolchildren, cemented his infamy in the national consciousness. Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, the man, was dead, but Guy Fawkes, the symbol of treason, was born. And for 300 years, that is all he remained. A villain in a nursery rhyme, a footnote in history books, a straw man to be ritually burned once a year as a celebration of state power, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of Catholic fanaticism. But history has a strange way of turning things on their head. The world changes, and with it, the meaning of old stories and old symbols. The long, slow rehabilitation of Guy Fawkes began not in a university lecture hall or a history book, but in the lurid, imaginative pages of a comic book. In the 1980s, in a Britain ruled by the iron will of Margaret Thatcher, a period of deep social division, industrial strife, and anti-authoritarian sentiment, a visionary writer named Alan Moore and a brilliant artist named David Lloyd created a graphic novel called V for Vendetta. It was set in a dystopian near future where a fascist, totalitarian regime has taken control of the United Kingdom. The hero of this dark story is a mysterious, charismatic, and deeply intellectual anarchist, revolutionary known only as V. To hide his identity from the surveillance state, he wears a mask. The mask he chooses is the stylized, smiling face of Guy Fawkes. In Moore's radical reinterpretation, V sees Fawkes not as a Catholic zealot, but as a man who was willing to use violence to destroy a corrupt and oppressive government. V seeks to finish what Fawkes started, to blow up Parliament. But his goal is not to install a new religious tyranny. It is the exact opposite. He aims to inspire the people to rise up, to cast off the shackles of mental slavery, and to govern themselves. Moore's genius was to take the historical figure, strip him of his actual ideology, and repurpose his most famous act as a symbol of something entirely new. He turned Guy Fawkes from a religious terrorist into a political freedom fighter. The graphic novel was a cult classic, but it was the 2005 film adaptation that brought the story, and more importantly the mask, to a global audience. The film streamlined Moore's complex anarchist philosophy into a more conventional but powerfully resonant message of liberty versus tyranny. The movie's tagline was simple and electrifying. People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. The image of thousands of ordinary anonymous citizens, all wearing Guy Fawkes masks, marching silently on Parliament became an iconic cinematic moment. The film rebranded Guy Fawkes for the 21st century. The mask was no longer just a historical curiosity. It was a cool, edgy, and potent symbol of rebellion. And then something remarkable happened. The symbol jumped off the screen and into the real world. In 2008, the nascent online hacktivist collective known as Anonymous used the mask during their real-world protests against the Church of Scientology. The mask was perfect for their needs. It provided physical anonymity. It was visually striking and instantly recognizable, and thanks to V for Vendetta, it was already loaded with anti-authoritarian meaning. It quickly became the public face of Anonymous, and by extension the face of online activism, civil disobedience, and the fight for information freedom. From there, its use exploded across the globe. During the Arab Spring, protesters in Egypt and Tunisia wore the mask as they faced down dictators. During the Occupy Wall Street movement, it became a ubiquitous sight in Zuccotti Park and in anti-capitalist protests around the world. In Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests, in anti-austerity rallies, in Greece and Spain, in Brazil and in Turkey, wherever people gathered to challenge the power of the state or of corporate interests, the smiling, enigmatic mask of Guy Fawkes appeared. This brings us to the great central irony of this entire 400-year story. The man, Guy Fawkes, was a religious fundamentalist. He was an absolutist, fighting to replace one form of monarchy with another, one that would have been even less tolerant than the one he sought to destroy. He believed in the divine right of kings and the supreme, unquestionable authority of the Pope. He would have been horrified by the modern ideas of democracy, anarchism, secularism, or personal liberty that the mask now represents. The symbol has become completely and irrevocably detached from the man. The mask is now a blank slate, a floating signifier onto which any group can project its own desire for rebellion. So, who was he? Was he a terrorist? By any modern definition of the word, yes. His plan would have caused mass civilian casualties and was intended to terrorize his opponents into submission. Was he a freedom fighter? In his own mind, certainly. He was fighting for the freedom of his fellow Catholics to practice their religion, a cause he believed was just and holy. History is rarely as simple as heroes and villains. He was a man of his time, a product of a violent and intolerant age. He was a man of immense courage and unwavering conviction. but he dedicated those virtues to a horrific and bloody cause. In the end, Guy Fawkes failed in everything he set out to do. He didn't kill the king. He didn't destroy Parliament. He didn't restore the Catholic faith in England. He was captured, broken by torture, and executed as a common traitor. By any rational measure, his life was a catastrophic failure. And yet 4 centuries later, his face is one of the most recognizable images on the planet. He is more famous, more iconic than the king he tried to kill. The man who wanted to impose an absolute religious authority has become the global face of the fight against authority itself. He lost the battle in the most spectacular way imaginable, but in a strange and twisted sense, he won the war for immortality. His story is a powerful reminder that history is not static. It is a story that we are constantly rewriting, reinterpreting, finding new meanings in old events. The man is gone, reduced to dust and a shaky signature on a confession, but the symbol, born from the ashes of his failure, lives on. It is a symbol of defiance, of the enduring human impulse to stand up and say no to power. And so we still remember the 5th of November, not for the reasons Parliament intended, not to celebrate the deliverance of a king, but to remember the man in the cellar, the terrorist who became an icon, the failure who became a legend.